Hello, team. Welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MSP. Ukraine War Kursk update for the 18th of August 2024. I'll probably be unable to do one of these Kursk updates for a couple of days, so let's just pop in and see what's been happening. Just very quickly, the area that the Ukrainians have taken in this Kursk incursion are much more significant in size than what we have seen in Pokrovsk, and Pokrovsk is a real problem for the Ukrainians. Of course, there's about a 70-kilometer width of attack and at least a 30-kilometer from 30 kilometer or so depth of attack for the Ukrainians. And if we go down to Pokrovsk, which, as mentioned, is your big area of concern for the Ukrainians, they are, I've accidentally measured something I didn't need to. They are here taking, they're about 30 or maybe 35 kilometers in depth. And depending on how wide you take this sector, about 26 kilometers there. It depends whether you include Touretsk and New York and whatnot. But you can see that it is not the size that they have lost in Kursk. So Ukraine are making hay while the sun shines up here. They're taking large amounts of land, and that is continuing by all accounts. As you can see, it's interesting from Andrew Perpetua's map, and this is a few hours out of date. It's very dynamic, and actually it's very conservative because you can only get information that's released on the socials, and the Ukrainians are being careful with OPSEC, so they're not releasing things until a couple of days after it happens. But here we see that the Russians are only really attacking one area. That was previously, you saw a number of red arrows here around Sudzha, where the Russians were trying to retake Martinovka and places around north of Sudzha. But it appears that the Ukrainians are the ones on the attack, and all areas of this sector, with the Russians only pushing back in the west at the moment. Now, the main area of concern for the Russians, well, there are several, they're all areas of concern, but there's a lot of work going on around Koronovo. There is now news that the Ukrainians have control of Komarovka, Visnevka, Apanasovka here. So these three, and indeed, I assume probably some of these other villages. The Ukrainians are claimed to be clearing out Koronovo. The Russians have denied this. Andrew Perpetua has half of the settlement still firmly under Russian control, but that is an area of a bone of contention between the two sides. Some very optimistic pro-Ukrainians are saying, well, next stop, Rilsk. I don't know whether the Ukrainians would have the capacity to be able to take somewhere as large as Rilsk, given that they also have to take all the places in between and then keep controlling them as they are making their front lines longer and longer, and so they'll be weaker and weaker defended. Okay, so the big news is about this River Seine that goes something like this, and the Ukrainians are not only coming in from the east underneath the river, they are also destroying the bridges along the river. They've now destroyed the bridge at Glushkovo here, and the bridge at Zvanoye here, and we've got visual evidence of that happening. There's a pontoon bridge somewhere around here that the Russians have built, and there's a third bridge, I would assume, there that the Ukrainians are looking to take out. But it's not just there, it's Tekhino, where there is the same river comes down here, and there's this area between the Russian and Ukrainian border and the same river that the Russians have now pulled back from and have blown their own bridges to stop the Ukrainians from following them. But it's Tekhino itself has been hammered over quite a period. In fact, this is an area, a settlement that the Russian Defense Corps or similar had attacked several times over the preceding months. They are taking out border points around here, the Ukrainians, with HIMARS. So anyway, we'll look at a few of these sources. No report says the second out of three bridges over the same river has been taken out. This one in Zvanoye, you can see you can only get like a motorbike or a quad across there safely now. So that one's done. You have Emil Kastelhemi saying the Ukrainians have damaged and destroyed bridges over the same river in order to cut logistical routes to Glushkovo, Tetkino, and other nearby areas. However, the Russians have already constructed at least one temporary bridge over the river. If the three bridges over the same get completely destroyed, it could cause the Russians significant logistical issues. However, there will most likely be more temporary bridges in all scenarios, and they want to avoid a local catastrophe. Those can, of course, be struck too. So the good thing about pontoon bridges is that if you're building a pontoon bridge, as has been seen here, that is well within. Look, there's 10 kilometers behind the border. You can still you can place your artillery and hit that pontoon bridge with just basic artillery at 21 kilometers. So it's really easy to hit with basic artillery, and that's a real challenge for the Russians. Attacking Glushkovka could be a logical next step if Ukraine wants to continue the offensive in new directions. It's mainly just countryside without anything actually significant in there itself, but with good preparation, it could serve as relatively potential decent land grab. And then we talk about Tetkino here. This is from PS01. In other news, Tetkino's days are numbered. Russian army has retreated in an organized manner to the eastern bank of the river. Same at Tetkino. Populated areas were evacuated. 2 bridges in Tetkino and Popovo Lezachi were blown up when the enemy approached. New prepared defense lines had been occupied. So that is to say that the Russians have pulled out of that area there, as you can see from this infographic or this map there. Okay, so Tendar then goes on to say Russian regime telegram channels report that Russian border checkpoint at Tetkino has been wiped out by HIMARS missiles. They're not disclosing the extent of the damage or casualties. Overall, it's obvious that Ukrainian forces are softening up the Russian lines in the Glushkovka district south of the same river, making this area increasingly difficult to be held by the Russian army. The battles in Koronovo sector are ongoing. So up here, they're fighting over Koronovo, moving to the west, possibly going to move up from the south in Tetkino area and cut off logistics along this river so that all the Russian forces that might be left here, some people saying 700 people may be in this area, Russian troops, are cut off and could end up being in a spot of bother. War Translated says Russian reports indicate that heavy fighting continues along the entire perimeter of the bridgehead in the Kursk region. The situation is especially difficult for them in Suzhensky, so that Sudzha and Glushkovsky districts. It is impossible to contain the Ukrainian offensive despite some optimism in the text. So this is the idea that the Russians are unable at the moment to contain the Ukrainians as the Ukrainians move forward everywhere. Now, Apti Alaudanov, the guy in charge of the Akhmat forces, the Chechen forces there, although they're mainly Russian these days, says, quote, the armed forces of Ukraine are stopped along the entire perimeter in the Kursk direction where the Akhmat special forces are located. He never fails to perform, says no reports of Alaudanov. Now, Alaudanov saying, well, wherever the Akhmat forces are, we have stopped the Ukrainians. Well, looks like the Akhmat aren't in very many places then. Anyway, I think that's probably just a lot of bravado from him. Now, Russian sources are saying that Ukrainian forces are clearing Koronovo. The next step will be Real City, says the Dead District. There are many members of the 155th Naval Infantry Brigade inside of Koronovo. Members of this brigade have beheaded a Ukrainian POW 2 days ago. Well, actually, they claim, or the order was given to behead 4 of them, 1 commander. So there might be some revenge to be sought, hopefully, within the regulations of international war or international regulations for war. But it could be that the 155th Naval Infantry Brigade stationed here might be under a lot of pressure from Ukrainians who want to get revenge for that horrific activity there. Now, no reports saying the 501st Battalion has captured Apanosovka, south of Koronovo yesterday. We reported attacks in the settlements, and apparently things have moved fast. More settlements are likely to be announced soon, such as Vizhnevka and Bayakovo, Novoivanovka, and Kulbaki are next. So there are a number of places around here that are either under the control of the Ukrainians or will be. According to Russian sources, Komarovka, west of Snagost, has come under the control of the Ukrainians, and furthermore, the Russians deny that Ukraine have already taken Koronovo, previously claimed by Ukrainian sources and indeed that Russian source. So we're yet to be seen exactly what happens with Koronovo, but I assume that there is just fierce fighting right in the middle of there at the moment, and the Ukrainians are pushing the Russians back further to the west here. Kulbaki, if that's gone, as is hinted or is on the way to being taken by the Ukrainians, then that that really does suggest that they are moving beneath this same river and looking to take. That would be sensible if they took all of this area there. That's probably quite doable without too much effort, and then use the river as a natural defence themselves. But anyway, we'll wait to see what happens there. So that's kind of most of the mapping information. We'll go on to look at a few more analyses. Fabian Hoffman says the Kursk offensive revealed that Russian reserves are as depleted as Ukraine's. That's what I said yesterday and what I've been saying for a long time. The notion that Russia has an infinite and steady supply of manpower and equipment is a myth. However, Russia still has latent capacity it can mobilize through 2024 to 27 and possibly longer. Ukraine's victory in this war hinges on sustained aid and equipment from Western partners to counter and outlast Russian mobilization of Romania's strategic reserves. I agree. Barring a domestic collapse in Russia, this appears to be the most feasible path to Ukrainian victory. That's why Germany's announcement to halt direct bilateral support is so devastating, even if they reconsider. If Russia believes it can potentially outlast the West, they would. Why would Russia back down before its capacity is fully exhausted? It's a terrible strategic blunder. Some people talking about how there is new news that the Nord Stream pipeline was actually the Ukrainians doing it, and Germany might have just halted any new stuff because they were annoyed with that pipeline being taken out by the Ukrainians. It could be just part of the way that they do their funding, that it will eventually come, but they're just halting it at the moment. But existing aid is being given. There are lots of different explanations of what the Germans are actually doing concerning that aid. I guess we will see. Kiev Independent says Russia is not ready for the Kursk Oblast counteroffensive, according to an Estonian official. Quote, there are no indications yet that Russian armed forces have enough forces and areas to deploy such significant actions, according to Lieutenant Colonel Matthias Pusep of the Estonian armed forces. And of course, that is kind of borne out by the idea that the Russians appear to be only counterattacking in one area there. So yeah. Now, Dmitry from War Translated again says a Russian channel alleges that Ukraine, quote, began introducing the main reserves in the form of fresh 95th Brigade with the task of rushing to Kurchatov. Lines have never been more red. And by red, I mean, I presume he means, problematic. But yeah, so there are places where the Ukrainians could be moving towards. Rilsk is one of them. Lugov is another, and up towards Kursk itself, and the nuclear power plant at Kurchatov. I think that's where it is, isn't it? Is that why Kurchatov is being mentioned? And that looks like cooling lakes, doesn't it? So it probably is here. That looks like that could be the site of a nuclear power plant. Anyway, yeah. So the Russians are some Russians are sounding sort of alarm bells in terms of where the Ukrainians might be aiming for. Now, Chris Owicki says this is a long but well worth reading tactical analysis of the Kursk attack. This is by Tendar. The Ukrainian offensive in Kursk has been ongoing for 12 days, and it's time to make an immediate assessment on all levels. Spoiler, it's a Ukrainian success story. Please indulge me. When in the morning hours of August 6th, the first news hit the Russian border post in Kursk was struck, not many could imagine the scale of what was going on. Many had the small cross-border raids in mind from last year when the Free Russian Legion was entering Belgorod and harassing a few border villages, but obviously that was not the case here. In order to summarize it properly, I will try to shed light on this from all relevant levels: tactical, operational, strategic, and political. Now, those raids could be seen as intel gathering, shaping operations by those Russian pro-Ukrainian forces. On a tactical level, the Russians were completely unprepared of what was coming. The border posts, such as Oleshnia, were quickly overrun, and the Russian conscripts in their posts surrendered fast. The initial response units of the Russian army were all but wiped out, and even a Ka-20 52 attack helicopter, which tried to interfere, was shot out of the sky. The Ukrainian strikes were coordinated on an extremely professional level using artillery, tanks, armored vehicles, drones, and other aerial vehicles. Communication and tactics showed that Ukrainian forces mastered what is commonly known as maneuver warfare. At no stage in this war, Russia has ever employed this kind of professionalism. In addition, the discipline among Ukrainian soldiers not to use mobile phones and disclose communication, as well as gains in territory, left Russians and the OSINT community relatively in the dark. The Ukrainian silence in preparation and execution of this operation might be the most astounding factor of this campaign. It almost flawlessly worked. On the operational level, aside from the tactical cleverness Ukrainians showed to us, it was and still is also the way they moved into the Kursk region. While Russian forces are infamous in trying to reach and overcome heavily fortified cities, towns, and villages, Ukrainians rather bypassed larger settlements, cut and intercepted the rear, and encircled Russian troop concentrations, and by so doing, staying even more in the shadows. This probably enabled the capture of large numbers of Russian POWs who found themselves quickly behind lines. Estimations go as high as 2,000 Russian soldiers being captured, a number so high that it might even be a strain for Ukrainian logistics, but it's obvious that this alone has already made the operation worthwhile. Russians, however, employed the same mistakes they made when starting the full-scale war back in February 2022. Some large columns, which were mustered, were not only detected by Ukrainian forces, but with the instance in Rilsk completely destroyed, this single event made an already difficult situation for Russian forces worse. It might turn out that this single event will be responsible for vast losses in territory, starting with Koronovo, which at this very hour is getting pounded and encircled. Overall, the whole Russian operation situation shows that they are only trying to stem the tide without any short-term hope of dislodging the enemy. The Ukrainian blitz has been an operational success despite Russian resistance in some areas. Strategic level, any tactical and operational planning and especially execution should follow an overarching strategy. We saw this when Ukrainian forces were successfully defeating Russian forces in Kiev and the north in March 22, and even more so when vast areas in Kharkiv and Kherson regions were liberated. Russians, on the other hand, lack a strategy other than trying to trick the enemy. There is nothing that really resembles a strategy, and this one is a questionable one for sure. The huge casualties in Bakhmut, Vuhledar, and Avdiivka, where hundreds of thousands of Russians were destroyed either by KIA or permanently wounded in action, didn't yield any strategic gain, neither in terms of territory nor in trying to disable the Ukrainian army altogether. It's obvious that the Kremlin was trying to perpetuate the illusion that Russia can do this forever. And this has been the Russian strategy ever since, combined with projecting red lines, which aim to stop or at least slow down Western aid for Ukraine in the hope to force Ukrainians into a dictated peace, which Putin could sell to his subjects. Ukraine could never allow itself to do the same for both military and also humanitarian reasons, since sending out countless meat waves was never a lasting solution for Ukraine. The counteroffensive in the south of 2023 got stuck. Despite some notable successes in the Russian rear, especially in Crimea, it was clear that Russia and its lesser minions in the west would exploit this, but it was preferable to preserve the strength rather than losing men in some fields in the south. A different approach was needed. The choice was to attack Russian lands in Kursk, which were not well defended and even less expected by Moscow. They made this an ideal target, and the successes speak for themselves. Ukrainian forces have achieved in 7 days more territorial gains than the Russians in 1 year of attrition warfare in Donetsk. The best part of this was achieved with the minimal casualties for the Ukrainians. Yes, there were some losses, especially with the MRAPs, and Russians will celebrate every one of them, but considering that Ukraine has thousands of them, its armory, and the West tens of thousands ready, it's not a serious concern. When playing the long game, it is imperative to use forces and reserves in the most efficient way, targeting weak spots and forcing the enemy to lose more troops and driving them beyond capacity. In fact, Russia was wasting huge amounts of human material and hardware against what was the Maginot Line in the Donbass. Anyone who studied the history of wars knows that fortresses and defense lines are meant to be attacked, which should be actually a no-brainer. The trick is to bypass them, and in so doing make them useless. Only when it is unavoidable do you attack them. When German forces were bypassing the Maginot Line in 1940, huge amounts of French military investments evaporated. Later in the African campaign, both German and British forces understood that supplies and logistics outweigh any territorial gains. If you can use the vastness of the territory to weaken your enemy, then it would be foolish not to do so. You should assume that the Russians understand at least some of this from their own history, but it's almost comical that in Ukraine, Putin and his entourage completely discarded that. You might assume that this resulted from their hubris, and I'm sure that their arrogance did their part. However, when seeing how atrociously bad Russians operate in combined arms warfare, it's explicable why they chose this bad option, because they are simply not capable of doing it differently. Summarizing, you can only conclude that the Ukrainian strategy is working. The breakthrough in Donetsk has been prevented. The Russian gains are small, even when dwarfed by the Ukrainian gains in Kursk, which are still ongoing, and the Russian gains come at a horrifically high price. To call this Pyrrhic does not do the term justice, because even Pyrrhic victories bear the term victory. Russians are nowhere near achieving even that, and Ukrainian forces might cause far more damage in Kursk if Russians are not relocating those troops to the sector, effectively dashing what they intended in Donbass. On a political level, implications might even be the most disastrous for the Russian war effort. Having Ukrainians firmly entrenched in Russian lands bodes not well from a military point of view itself, but the picture it projects is far worse than anything that Russians have experienced so far. Putin was so devoted to project that Russia was strong again. He and his propaganda channels are going to great lengths to portray the 1990s and democracy as a rule of weakness, and in contrasts him and his dictatorship as the rule of strength and stability. Having a defeat in Kursk under his watch, where Russia had to concede to a foreign force territory and allow them permanent hold of Russian lands, it is a situation that has never occurred since 1945, not even during the 90s. Ukrainian conquests of the Russian territories are the latest signs of how weak Russia really is. When reflecting that the whole Russian economy has been relegated to sustain this war, it makes this embarrassment even more embarrassing. Russia is devoted to this war and cannot even hold its own borders, basically adding insult to injury. That will stick. And not even Russia's propaganda channels are capable of fending this off. There's some disagreement that actually he's able to maintain a tight informational hold on the Russian public, and they don't really know what's going on. Putin's meek response speaks louder than anything else. The emperor's new clothes are exposed once again, and he is more afraid than ever. Russia is vulnerable, and it cannot be hidden anymore. Ukrainian forces firmly control the border areas in Kursk, and God knows how many reserves are waiting for this, and even another incursion. Even when it would be possible to stop the Ukrainian advance, is unlikely to dislodge them before the end of the year, if ever during this war. This is extremely important to point out. Putin was already preparing to arm twist Ukraine into a dictated ceasefire. All that he needed was a steady. All that he needed is a steady, even when slow. I'm not quite sure of the English there. Slow advance in Donbass and Western governments in buying. Okay, so what he's trying to say is all that Putin needed was a slow and steady attritional advance in the Donbass to really get Western governments to question what they were doing. It was absolutely imperative for him to deny Ukrainians any kind of territorial success. This is now more important to him than his horrific losses, because he thought that he would reach a suitable point before his reserves were spent. This was emphasized when he and his lesser minions were always pointing out that the Russians were advancing, ignoring that those advances were minuscule. With Ukrainians in Kursk on Russian lands, this has shifted dramatically. He cannot even think of ceasefire as long as Ukrainians control even an inch of Russia. But his problems are that he will need another hugely costly campaign, similar to what has been going on for 2 years in the Donbass, without even a sight of the end. Russia already squandered huge amounts of human material and hardware, and we all know that his reserves are burning down. Depending on analysts, the Soviet reserves are spent by 26 to 27. Russia cannot sustain this war forever, and Putin cannot allow Ukrainians on Russian lands. The planners in Kiev skillfully recognize this and maneuvered Putin into a corner where his demise is expedited. They also exposed Russian weaknesses and presented their Western backers that Ukraine can win this war. If the weapons and ammunition are guaranteed, the West should take note of the success and draw the right conclusions. There are no Russian red lines, only bluffs. German-made tanks are in Russia, destroying Russians, and we are all here. The bluff is called. This war can be ended quickly, either militarily or with decisive Russian defeat, which will cause a political change inside Russia. The Kursk operation has laid this completely open, and it is time to do some serious action in the West in order to break Putin Russia's neck once and for all. Okay. So that's a very positive outlook on what's going on. And I don't necessarily disagree with that. I think the Russian reserves are very weak. I think, as Fabian Hoffman said, if the Germans really are pulling back on support for Ukraine at the moment, that is just the worst time to do that. This is when nails should be being punched into coffins. I'm not saying this is the end of Russia, but this is a huge success for the Ukrainians at the moment. It all depends on where they're going to go with this, but the Russians seem to be, at the moment at least, unable to do much about it. Shashank Joshi has written a piece in The Economist, my leader opinion piece in this week's Economist, on the Kursk offensive. It argues that Ukraine is ethically and legally justified in taking the fight onto Russian soil, but for lasting advantage, it has to be careful not to overstretch itself, something I keep talking about. It also argues, as we've done before, that the military benefits of loosening, not necessarily eliminating Western restrictions on long-range missile strikes, outweighs the escalation risk. Agreed. Russian air bases are increasingly important targets. In fairness, I should note that some experts argue that Russia has already largely moved aircraft out of range of Western strike weapons, and that other targets would be higher priorities than airfields. And I think that's unfortunately true. I think the horse has already bolted. And so trying to bomb those airfields now might be less useful. Now, Western military Western military estimates suggest Ukraine has committed as many as 6,000 soldiers to Kursk, according to Wall Street Journal, and has up to 4,000 additional troops to support roles in the Sumy region. So that's as many as 10,000 troops committed to the incursion into Kursk, which is huge and shows that this is a proper thing for the Ukrainians and could be this is their big move. This is their big move. You can talk about whether they can take Transnistria and Crimea, but I don't think they've got the troops for that, and there's logistical support for that. Support troops and other entities. I think this is the big one. Now, there are some interesting analyses on the Russian troop situation inside Kursk, and we're just going to pop into this. This will be the last thing I say. So, Lovely Lad gives us an analysis of why the Russian defense in Kursk has failed. I talk about conscripts, defensive works, readiness, minefields, and more. On August 6th, 2 Ukrainian battalions crossed the border with practically no resistance. There was the Russian defense. Where was the defense and what was it doing? The FSB's Department of the Border Protection Office in Sudzha was in charge of protecting the border in that sector, and on paper they had a very good defensive network to work with. The defensive systems had a plethora of trenches and fighting positions covered by anti-tank obstacles and minefields. The Sudzha sector had never had any action, unlike the border in Belgorod, which was guarded by actual contract troops. And as a result, readiness was to the bottom and complacency had long taken over. The area was guarded by the Russian 17th and 18th battalions, which were conscript battalions created under the Russian 488th Regiment, but under the FSB command. In Russia, conscripts that do their 12-month mandatory service are not allowed to go into a foreign war, so instead they were put into newly created border protection battalions to be at least of some use in the war effort. Just so we are clear on this topic, the actual fighting battalions of the 488s are still in Crimea. That's in Ukraine, right? So although the border was mainly manned by conscripts, there were also FSB elements in this area, as well as elements from units refitting in training bases in the rear, like the 200th and 1428th. Generally, the 18th Battalion was a lot more disciplined than the 17th, and they were actually typically it moves again, and they were more disciplined than the 17th, and they were actually manning their positions. They were holding the line from Gornau to Plakovo. The 18th Battalion was equipped with mortars, AGSs, so grenade launchers, and some RPGs, rocket-propelled grenades, which basically made them simple light infantry capable of holding their positions. Although talking about discipline, the 17th Battalion set a very low bar, and the 18th Battalion had complacency inside their positions. The 17th Battalion was barely preparing to fight a war. They were more prepared for a nice 9-month vacation to the Kursk Oblast. The entire battalion was mainly in 2 different positions: a big, nice, and comfortable bunker system near Sverdlovkovo and a border post near Sudzha. They were only really doing their border patrols because it was prohibited by law not to, and in 2 days the entire battalion was encircled and as good as gone. The defenses built by General Surovikin in the previous year were barely a roadblock to the Ukrainians, as no one was manning them. The anti-tank ditches, minefields, and Dragon's Teeth were breached without an issue at all. Ukraine was using its most modern UAVs, drones, and electronic warfare in the area. They destroyed most Russian intelligence, surveillance, and capabilities and limited the Russian helicopter fleet's abilities with anti-aircraft FPVs. So they had FPV drones working on Russian helicopters. There was a great potential for a defense in this sector, but no one was manning the concrete reinforced fortifications, and the Russians just got encircled in their packed positions. The Russian 17th Battalion was destroyed, and the 18th significantly damaged as it was outflanked. As of today, the Russians are calling more and more conscripts to Kursk, as they are legally allowed to use them anywhere inside Russia. We see a lot of units like the 22nd Regiment, and we believe that these units got redeployed most of the time. The conscript battalions most of the time it's conscript battalions under their command. The Russians have been seen creating anti-tank ditches in their rear, usually MDK-3 vehicles from engineering battalions are used, but in this case, civilian companies with government contracts are creating field fortifications and trenches using excavators. The funny thing is that many job adverts have appeared on Avito, an equivalent of eBay, about the construction of trenches in Kursk. With the general arrival of conscripts, artillery batteries, and tanks, the Russian defense is only getting stronger, though. So they are getting stronger, but they started off incredibly weak. Now you can say they're only getting stronger. Are they getting stronger with just more conscripts? Are they bringing other more meaningful forces to the front line? Well, they are taking forces away from elsewhere along the front line down in the east and the south, though trying not to strip Pokrovsk direction and Terezk direction from the most successful troops at the moment. So it will become more and more challenging for the Ukrainians, especially as the front line gets longer and longer. Now, just a few things to note that I mentioned earlier in my previous video. Russian opinion, I mean, this is just an anecdote. This is one single woman saying, a Russian woman saying that she does not know what's going on in Russia's Kursk region, but she is assured that America is to blame. And this is a classic opinion from a typical Russian that, yeah, whatever bad is happening is the Americans, and if it's not them, it's British. It's weird that you don't know what's going on in Kursk, but you do know it's the Americans. Yeah, interesting. Mopping up operations have revealed many Russian conscripts, and this is what I talked about previously, have tried to change into civilian clothing to escape capture, and that's why I think we've seen Russian military uniform, being found in the middle of woods, because the Russians themselves are ditching them. It's not part of any perfidy operation, but the Russians are ditching them and then going and getting civilian clothing on and trying to get out with evacuations of local residents here. So there have been mopping up operations that have found civilians. Although those two men there were not in civilian clothes. In that video, there are other people in civilian clothes, but unfortunately, the thread is not acting in a way that I want it to. And then we have other examples of just real shameful activity and behavior of Russians. Here we have dogs who have been left either in kennels or chained up, been left by Russians who have evacuated from their homes. Russians left behind their dogs on chains. Note that the intact house. Ukrainian soldiers are now feeding and caring for these dogs. So not only are the Ukrainians not liberating villages by flattening them, as the Russians do all over Ukraine, they are only really attacking military targets in Kursk. They are also apparently feeding the dogs that have been left behind by the Russians. And also, here we have an example of a frail, partially paralyzed Russian grandmother left in a house on a bed by Russian evacuees who have got out of Dodge and left not just a dog chained up, but left a paralyzed grandmother. And it's up to the Ukrainians to help out these people. They've created humanitarian corridors and telephone lines. They are feeding these civilians and dogs. They are providing water and electricity, I believe, to houses that are cut off. So, yeah, there's a bit of PR involved in this, isn't there? But also, just that's the difference, I think, between Ukrainian and Russians, certainly Ukrainian and Russian troops. But it seems also like the civilians too. Anyway, that's my update for Kursk. Thank you for watching. Really appreciate your support. Take care, guys. Let me know what you think, and I'll speak soon.